You know, in all of this talk about Russians and their potential role in this election, and their potential role in current events in general here in the United States, it's really important to, I think, to separate three categories of information: what we believe to be true, what we don't know is true or not true, and what we know to not be true. And the reason for that is that in the fog of the new Cold War, the facts matter a lot. So here to talk to us about one aspect of the Russia discussion now is Gareth Porter. Gareth is an independent journalist. He is also a historian. He writes a lot on national security policy, specifically U.S. national security policy. And his latest book is Manufactured Crisis: The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. He's written on this subject now. Gareth, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
You bet. You had a piece out recently in Consortium News on mainstream media's Russian Bogeyman, however that's pronounced. What specifically were you referring to?
Well, I think the title doesn't quite capture the essence of the piece, which is not so much about mainstream media, although they are implicated in it through the Washington Post, but really focusing on the Department of Homeland Security and its role in fact, creating a Russian bogeyman in terms of hacking into the U.S. infrastructure. This is a subcategory of this overall theme of the Russian bogeyman, if you will, that we are now dealing with. Of course, DHS is one of the major intelligence and security agencies that have been in the forefront of providing this official view that Russia was trying to use hacking of the DNC and of John Podesta's emails to help elect Donald Trump. And that is certainly one aspect of the DHS role politically at this point in regard to what I think you've correctly called this new Cold War that security agencies in the United States are vested in with Russia. But my piece was really about how the DHS fabricated, not just once, but twice over the past 5 years, basically fabricated bogus stories about how Russia had supposedly hacked into two different companies' infrastructure or grids, one in Burlington, Vermont, which many of your listeners may recall just a few weeks ago, the other 5 years ago in a suburb of Springfield, Illinois.
Yeah, let's talk. Let me just jump in for a second there, Gareth. Yep. Okay, so this is based on what I'd already read, but especially on what you wrote. This is something I'd put in that third category of things that have been said that we can know are not true. In other words, during all the discussion we've been having about Russia's possible role in the 2016 election and so on, all of a sudden in the middle of it, there was this story that Russian cyber forces had hacked into the United States power grid, which is, of course, enormously critically important. It's a form of cyber terrorism. It could be used, if you just read the headlines, it sounds like Russia could plunge the nation into a blackout or, cause our nuclear reactors to spin out of control or whatever. But in fact, both a few weeks ago, I had not remembered the stories from 2011, so I thought that connection was fascinating. But the gist of it is that no such thing really happened, right?
That's absolutely right. And this is, as you point out, extremely important to understand, because what it tells us is that focusing now just on DHS without getting into other national security organs and their behavior, we can absolutely say with certainty that the DHS deliberately put out a story they knew that was not true in regard to the Burlington, Vermont electric department or company. And they did so because they had good reason to believe that this was a way to build up a fear of Russia's cyber hacking in terms of the infrastructure, and to make people believe that they needed a strong, powerful DHS in order to deal with that threat. In other words, what we're talking about here is a major, of course, it's a relatively new national security bureaucracy, which is on the make, which is looking for ways to promote itself, and in the process, not really caring very much about the truth.
Okay, so let's just jump in for a second. First of all, again, we're talking with journalist and historian Gareth Porter about the untrue stories that Russia hacked the power grid in Burlington, Vermont. Just to close the loop on that story, what really happened and what DHS apparently knew before the stories came out is that somebody with a laptop who was not even connected to the utilities mainframes or systems or networks or anything, somebody clicked on a site that was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding, clicked on a site like people do all the time that was either phishing or potentially a phishing site with some sort of unclear linkage to the Russians, but at no time was that connected to the utilities computer systems, right?
Well, that's the first point. Yes, you're absolutely right, that the story that came out through the Washington Post via the Department of Homeland Security was indeed that the Russians had hacked into the grid, the power grid in Burlington, Vermont. And that, of course, was totally false. And in fact, within hours, the Post was forced to retract that part of the story, that in fact, the power grid had been hacked in Burlington, Vermont. But it continued to stick with the story that the computer, that a computer of the Burlington, Vermont Electric Department had been hacked by the Russians, that there were indicators that it had been hacked by the Russians. And that is because DHS was telling the Washington Post that that was the case. Now, here's what we don't know exactly at what moment DHS knew the truth. But what we do know is that certainly within 24 hours, they, without any question, had established the fact that there was no Russian hacking of that computer, that in fact, what the site that in question was a Yahoo cloud site for email, an email server, and that it was therefore, there was no connection with the Russians. And they waited 3 days, almost 3 days, before they told the Washington Post the truth. And the Post then backed off that part of the story, which was, of course, very, very important, that they were still reporting that even though the grid had not been hacked, this showed that the Russians were tapping into a computer that belonged to one of the U.S. Infrastructural companies, and that showed the vulnerability of the U.S. infrastructure. And that, of course, was in the end shown to be just absolutely untrue. So, I mean, the real point here again is that the DHS let the story float for a couple of days, knowing the truth and not telling the Post about it.
So let's talk a little bit more about motivation. You talked about motivation. Now, obviously, any institutional bureaucracy has motivation to make the public believe that its services are greatly needed. So is it your feeling that the entirety of DHS's motivation and allowing this, I mean, first of all, could this have just been negligence, sloppiness on their part, or does this sound to you like intentional misinformation, particularly given the 2011 story that you alluded to in your piece?
I think there are elements of both. And it's important to understand that it is a combination of those two things. First of all, just to step back for a moment to how this story really cropped up. DHS had sent out, along with the FBI, a notice to all infrastructure institutions in the United States on, if I remember correctly, December 29th. And this was a longish paper that included what they called indicators of Russian hacking, of hacking by the same team, that is the team that did what they called Grizzly Step. That is the operation that they say the Russians were carrying out to affect the US election in 2016. So they were explicitly telling these hundreds and hundreds of infrastructure companies that these website IP addresses that they were sending them, as well as other tools, kinds of cyber tools that could be used to disrupt operations, were indicators of the presence of Grizzly Step in their computers. And that was highly misleading. As I point out in my story, I quote Robert M. Lee, who founded a cybersecurity company, but before that was in the US government and was involved in actually creating the first defensive system against cyber attack on US infrastructure. So he is one of the top experts on this whole subject in the country. And he actually examined closely the notice that was sent out, the paper that was sent out by DHS and FBI. It was really written by DHS. FBI went along for the ride. And he and his staff found that it was highly misleading, that inevitably the people getting this paper would believe, they were going to believe that they were threatened. They were under threat because they would inevitably find something in their computer that matched what the DHS was saying was an indicator of Grizzly Step.
But which in fact was actually relatively or completely benign and unconnected to Russia, at least as far as we know.
Right, exactly. And what Robert M. Lee found with his staff was that only a very small minority, a small percentage of those indicators were really truly indicators of potential Russian hacking. The vast majority of them were clearly innocent, and that's why it was so completely misleading and dangerous, really.
Yeah, and as we're going to have to close up pretty soon, Gareth Porter, but in terms of closing thoughts, one of the reasons why I think this story is important is because, agencies and organizations have institutional drives, they want more funding and whatever, but I feel that it's a core mission of every federal agency, and especially a national security agency, to first of all, not mislead the American people, and even more importantly, not create an atmosphere of hysteria. So in about the 60 seconds we have left, your thoughts on that?
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, this should be a matter that raises the hackles of both activists, of people who are who make it their job to find the truth and point it out and really make an issue of it, but also people in Congress should be very upset about the fact that this Department of Homeland Security created a little mini bit of hysteria for a few days over a completely false story, and one that they very quickly knew was false.
Yeah, and I would only...
This is a template for a lot of what we're going to be seeing in the future, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, no, I agree. And of course, people read the wild accusations. They don't tend to read the clarifications later, which only makes it worse. So, Gareth Porter, thanks for writing this piece, which again, for our readers, is entitled Mainstream Media's Russian Bogeyman, even though that's not precisely the focus of the piece. So thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard.